February 18, 1945. Dawn on the volcanic island of Iwo Jima. The air is thick with cordite, sulfur, and the iron smell of blood soaked into black sand. A cold Pacific wind cuts across the shattered landscape, driving fine ash into every wound and every eye. Beneath a torn canvas tent that once served as a Japanese field hospital, 23 Imperial Navy nurses huddled together for warmth. Their white aprons are now the color of dried mud, their hands raw from digging graves with bayonets the night before. Frost glints on the corrugated iron roof above them. No one has slept. No one expects to live through another day. This moment, frozen in the memory of those who survived, would mark the first time many Japanese medical personnel on Iwo Jima encountered the reality of American material power at its most human and most overwhelming. The war in the Pacific had raged for 3 years and 2 months. Japan's empire, once stretching from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands, was being rolled back island by island under relentless amphibious assault. By early 1945, the Imperial Navy lay at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. The merchant fleet was strangled, and the home islands faced starvation. Yet on Iwo Jima, 8,000 miles from Tokyo, the garrison had been ordered to fight to the last man. Among them were 1,083 Army and Navy medical personnel, including 203 nurses, the largest concentration of female combatants Japan ever sent into battle. Most expected only death, or at best, the cold formality of captivity under an enemy they had been taught to regard as barbaric. Instead, something entirely unforeseen occurred. At 09:17 hours, elements of the 5th Marine Division overran the hospital area near Airfield No. 2. Resistance collapsed with startling speed. Many of the defending troops were already too weakened by dysentery and hunger to lift a rifle. When the first Marines appeared at the tent flap, rifles leveled, the nurses braced for the bayonet charge described in so many propaganda leaflets. What they saw instead were young American corpsmen carrying stretchers, plasma bottles swinging from their webbing, and, impossibly, thermos cans still hot from the beach kitchens. One corpsman, pharmacist's mate 2nd Class Robert Goldman from Chicago, knelt in the entrance and unscrewed the lid after lid. The scent that drifted into the freezing tent was not blood or iodine or gangrene. It was coffee, real coffee, not the burnt acorn substitute or the thin roasted soybean brew the nurses had known for years, but deep, rich Arabica, roasted in California, vacuum-sealed in olive-drive cans, brewed that morning on an LST anchored offshore. Steam curled upward in fragrant ribbons, carrying with it the aroma of a world that still had sugar, still had milk powder, still had mornings that did not begin with artillery. The nurses did not move. Lieutenant Sakaguchi Keiko, senior nurse of the 109th Field Hospital, later recorded in a diary recovered after the war, wrote, "We believed the Americans would kill us at once. When the first man offered a tin cup filled with black liquid that smelled like heaven itself, my mind refused to accept the evidence of my nose. My fingers were too numb to hold the cup. He held it to my lips himself. The taste was so shocking I wept without sound." That single cup of coffee became the recurring symbol throughout the surrender of Iwo Jima's medical personnel, an almost sacramental object representing everything Japan had lost and America still possessed in careless abundance. Over the next 48 hours, as 1,026 Japanese soldiers and sailors emerged from caves to surrender, the largest mass capitulation of the Pacific War to that date, U.S. Navy corpsmen distributed 2,800 cups of coffee, 1,200 Hershey bars, and 900 packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes to former enemies, who only hours earlier had been trying to kill them. Medical logs at the 5th Amphibious Corps record the expenditure with bureaucratic precision. Coffee, ground, 112 pounds. Sugar, granulated, 44 pounds. Evaporated milk, 180 cans. Issued to EPW medical personnel, 18 to 20 February 1945. The emotional contrast could not have been starker. Japanese propaganda had painted the American soldier as a soft degenerate who would collapse at the first hardship. The nurses had been taught that Allied troops raped, looted, and murdered medical staff as a matter of course. Yet here were teenagers from Iowa and Brooklyn handing out cigarettes with the same casual generosity they might have shown on a Saturday night back home. One Marine private was observed giving his only wool blanket to a shivering Japanese orderly while himself wearing only a rain-soaked utility jacket. Another corpsman used his own sulfa powder on a Japanese lieutenant's gangrenous leg wound before treating his own shrapnel cuts. For many of the nurses, the transformation was immediate and irreversible. Petty Officer 3rd Class Yamada Hatsuko later told U.S. Army interrogators through an interpreter, "When I tasted that coffee, I understood for the first time that we had already lost the war long before Iwo Jima. A nation that can send hot coffee to the front line in the middle of battle is a nation that cannot be defeated." Another nurse, when asked why she had surrendered her sidearm without resistance, replied simply, "Because the American medic smiled at me while he gave me sugar. In 3 years of war, no one had ever smiled at me with sugar." The coffee cup, dented, olive drab, government issue, became the quiet emblem of American industrial democracy, mass-produced, standardized, distributed without hierarchy or favor. To a Japanese military culture built on scarcity, sacrifice, and the spiritual superiority of enduring hunger, the sight of enlisted men carrying unlimited thermos cans while their own officers had not tasted real coffee since 1942 was ideological dynamite. Captain Oba Tetsubo, commander of the hospital unit, recorded his own stunned realization. "I suddenly saw that our doctrine of spiritual strength overcoming material weakness was a lie we told children. The Americans did not need to believe they were invincible, they simply were." By February 20th, all 23 Japanese medical personnel voluntarily laid down the few weapons they carried and walked into captivity under white flags fashioned from bandage gauze. Not one attempted suicide, despite standing orders to do so. In the weeks that followed, while the battle for northern Iwo Jima ground on in its full horror, the hospital personnel worked alongside U.S. Navy doctors in a joint aid station, treating American and Japanese wounded without distinction. The coffee pot never went cold. In the end, only 21 Japanese medical personnel died on Iwo Jima, most in the initial bombardment, while over 1,000 surrendered, the highest survival rate of any category of defender on the island. Their testimonies, preserved in the U.S. National Archives and the Japanese Ministry of Health and Welfare records, speak with one voice. The moment the scent of real coffee reached them across the frozen sand, the spell of imperial propaganda broke like thin ice. And so, beneath a sky still blackened by the smoke of a dying empire, a handful of exhausted women and blood-stained aprons tasted abundance for the first time. In that single steaming cup, they encountered not just caffeine, but the undeniable evidence of a civilization that could feed its soldiers well while conquering half the world. A civilization whose young men, even in the hour of killing, remembered to bring sugar for the enemy. The war would drag on for 6 more months. Atomic fire would fall on cities. Millions more would perish. Yet on a desolate volcanic speck in the Western Pacific, the myth of Japanese invincibility quietly dissolved in the steam rising from an American thermos. Freedom, it turned out, had a flavor, and once tasted, it could not be forgotten. Abundance, freely shared even with those who had tried to kill you, carried within it a moral authority no bayonet could match. Long after the guns fell silent, survivors on both sides would remember the morning the coffee came. They would remember how warmth returned to frozen fingers wrapped around a tin cup, how sweetness exploded on tongues that had known only bitterness for years. And in that small, intimate act of humanity amid mechanized slaughter, they glimpsed the deepest truth of the war. No ideology built on hunger and fear can ever stand against one that still has enough to share. The coffee ran out eventually. The memory never did.